Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're opening up a text that is, well, it's way more than just dry, ancient history. We're looking at the book of Joel, and we're going to approach it as this terrifying, awe-inspiring theological drama. The source material we're diving into treats this book not just as some old record of a famine, but as a sweeping masterpiece. It ties together the theology of creation, absolute judgment, and ultimately restoration. I want you to imagine a disaster so unprecedented, so completely devastating, that it literally shatters all living memory. That is exactly how Joel begins. He calls the whole community together as witnesses and asks this chilling question. Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Now, it's a rhetorical question, right? Because the answer is absolutely not. No way. This catastrophe is something they have never seen before, and God is using it to demand their total, unwavering attention. Okay, let's dive right into this with Section 1. The locust army invades. Let's look at the literal ground-level devastation that kicks off this narrative. Joel demands that this event be permanently anchored in covenant memory. He actually commands the elders to pass the warning down through an unbroken chain. We're talking from his generation to their children, to their grandchildren, and out into all future generations. So this isn't just some oral history project, It's a sacred responsibility. This disaster absolutely must become a permanent theological teacher for the future. It's a warning they can literally never afford to forget. And the disaster itself? It comes in this terrifying, relentless four-stage wave. What the chewing locust leaves, the swarming locust eats. What the swarming locust leaves, the crawling locust eats. And then what the crawling locust leaves, the consuming locust completely devours. It is an inescapable siege. Every single remaining source of life is systematically removed until absolutely nothing survives. But what makes this so incredibly chilling is a specific Hebrew word used here, arabe. It literally translates to become many. And get this, it's the exact same word used for the devastating 8th plague upon Egypt back in the book of Exodus. Do you see the bitter irony here? God's covenant people, the ones famously redeemed from Egypt, are now suffering the very same devastating judgment that was once inflicted upon their ancient captors. It's a profound, terrifying reversal of their own history. Moving on to Section 2, a failed covenant community. So we need to zoom out from the bugs themselves and look at the devastating social and religious impact this plague has on Israel. As a failed covenant community, this disaster spares absolutely no one. The judgment expands across every single tier of society. It hits the elders, the keepers of civic and historical memory. It hits the drunkards, representing a completely spiritually numb society. It ruins the farmers, the laborers of the field whose vocations are totally frustrated. And finally, it reaches the priests, the spiritual mediators of the temple. The entire community is just paralyzed. But notice who Joel targets first with a direct command. He addresses the drunkards. Now, why start with those intoxicated by wine? Well, because their intoxication represents a much deeper spiritual insensitivity. God is using the total removal of their false security, their wine, their earthly pleasures, to spiritually awaken a society that has gone completely numb to Him. The loss of their comfort is essentially God's alarm clock. And this leads us to a devastating domino effect over at the temple. Think about it. Without grain or grapes, there's no flour or wine. Without flour or wine, the daily grain and drink offerings at the temple simply cease. And when the offerings cease, corporate worship stops entirely. So the crucial point here is that this agricultural collapse is actually a direct interruption of Israel's covenant communion with God. The ecosystem and the sanctuary are deeply, inextricably interconnected. All right, Section 3, the collapse of reality. And this brilliantly illustrates our core theological theme. Joel isn't just describing a bad economy. He's describing a total collapse of reality. It's a literal decreation. We can really see the stark contrast when we place Eden right next to Joel's reality. On day 3 of creation in Genesis, we have ordered abundance, right? Vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees flourishing. But in Joel chapter 1, we see the exact reversal. The fields are wasted, the grain is destroyed. The vine, the fig, the pomegranate, the palm, and apple trees are stripped entirely bare, down to the white bark. Joel is systematically unordering Genesis. He's literally running creation backwards. To understand why this is happening, we've got to understand a really profound concept called anthropocosmic resonance. I know, it sounds complex, but it simply means that environmental collapse and theological rebellion are deeply connected. Human covenant failure actually reverberates through the physical created order. Because humanity broke the covenant, the soil, the trees, the vines, creation itself begins to suffer and unravel. The failure of the community guarantees the failure of the cosmos. Joel makes this connection incredibly personal and honestly really poetic. He says, "The land mourns." He personifies the very soil and the trees as grieving. And because the trees wither, the final tragic result is that human joy has withered away. You see, joy in this context wasn't just an emotion. It was a tangible covenant blessing that flowed directly from living in communion with God in a fruitful land. So when the covenant breaks, creation withers, and joy totally disappears. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, is this really just an environmental disaster? Are these just very hungry insects doing what insects do? Let's look at Section 4, Inside the Divine Courtroom. The answer to that question is a resounding no. Let's pull back the curtain and step inside the divine courtroom. Notice the massive shift in language here. Joel says, "For a nation has come up against my land." The bugs are no longer just some agricultural nuisance, they're an invading army, described as a nation with the teeth of a lion. And more importantly, Yahweh calls it my land. This is a military force trespassing on God's personal property. They are executing judgment on his sacred geography. So the crucial point is that Joel is portraying a covenant lawsuit, or a rib in Hebrew. The locust plague is acting as the physical executioner of a divine legal verdict, based on the covenant curses, the very same curses Moses warned them about centuries earlier in Deuteronomy 28. God has summoned his people into his heavenly courtroom. He found them in breach of their agreement, and he dispatched this biological army to enact the legal sanctions. Because this is a legal and covenantal crisis, the response can't just be some sort of agricultural reform. The priests, who are the legal representatives of the people, are commanded to lead a massive national response. They have to trade their glorious, beautiful priestly garments for sackcloth. They must lament, wail, lie all night in mourning, consecrate a national fast, and call a sacred assembly at the temple. They basically must act as legal advocates, pleading desperately with a divine judge for mercy. Which brings us to Section 5, the divine warrior approaches. This is really the climax of the narrative. As the disaster deepens, Joel masterfully blurs the lines between what is happening naturally and what it means prophetically. The locusts? Yes, they're a biological swarm, but they represent a terrifying invading army. The famine is economic ruin, sure, but it's truly covenant judgment. And the devastation looks like an agricultural catastrophe, but it is actually the Creator himself commanding his creation. The locusts are God's own military force. He is the divine warrior leading the charge against his own rebellious people. And this ultimately brings us to the theological center of the entire text. Joel cries out, "Alas for the day of the Lord is at hand." This physical locust plague, as terrifying as it is just a type. It's a shadow of the ultimate eschatological day of the Lord. The current disaster is a merciful, albeit super painful, warning. It's designed to awaken the people before that final day of absolute destruction from the Almighty arrives. Which leaves us with a profound question to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer. When the collapse of reality arrives, when your joy withers, and the things you rely on are stripped bare, is your hope placed in your earthly harvest, or is it placed in the divine warrior who ultimately commands it? Joel teaches us that everything in creation answers to the Creator, and true security is found only in covenant with Him. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep seeking the deeper truths within these ancient texts.